all too often we look at organizations and we tend to see how they can be used as means for a greater purpose, which is why we create them. But all too often it ends up creating its own collective ego, it ends up creating its own boundaries. And so the question is, how do we start to dissolve those boundaries and be much more inclusive? And it's not that the boundaries are not useful, they often are useful. But if we get too attached to a particular boundary, then it becomes very limiting. So how do we start to engage with this creative constraint? And it's a constraint, and I don't think tension is necessarily a bad thing in the sense that, like we were saying earlier, the guitar string, if it's too tight, it pops. If it's too loose, there's no music. It needs that perfect tension, So how do we hold this idea of creating a boundary lightly, with its usefulness, but also lightly? And I think one very interesting lever for this is to really expand the kinds of capital that is used within the institutions. If it's funneled primarily, if it's driven primarily by financial capital, it is going to be biased in the direction of transaction. And then even within that circle, even within that boundary, things will become very quid pro quo. And that is going to limit the transformation potential. So while you're doing that, while you're engaging maybe even with financial capital, how do you start to include other forms of capital which are not degenerative? Money has certain advantages. It can provide really quick feedback loops, which is great in many situations, but it's also degenerative. That if I'm moved by money today, I'll need more money tomorrow for me to continue engaging with it, right? So how do you start to couple financial capital with alternate forms of capital? And what are those alternate forms of capital? How do we amplify it? What does it look like for leadership to hold different capitals on a spectrum together? Because it takes a very different kind of leader. If you're just financial, if you're just transactional, you need a powerful sort of top-down leadership, right? Hierarchical leadership. And that works with extrinsic motivators, but it doesn't quite work with intrinsic motivators. It doesn't work with alternate forms of capital. So how do you create an ecosystem that has a boundary, but the boundaries are fluid, that engages with financial capital and transactions, but also is able to engage in much more indirect reciprocity, much more principled sort of behavior? And what kind of leadership does it take? We call them ladders, not leaders. Ladders are people who are able to hold, and you're not necessarily at the top. Others climb over you, and that's just as great because we're all playing a role. So what does that look like? What does it take to hold such a space? And so I think these are the kinds of questions that I would ask with the organizations and the associations that we're a part of, to support the emerging paradigm, to support a higher consciousness. I think Association for Mindfulness in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland is an effort to bring like-minded people together around these values of mindfulness and compassion. And I think together, if we all come together, we can make the world perhaps a little bit better, but certainly support each other in being the change and trusting in the non-linear ripple effect of these small acts of love. So thank you very much for being together and being in community.